Parks is due to return to council next week, and Mr. Labange is not expected today, so this is a committee of one with a capacity crowd out in the audience. Thank you all for being here early. Let's go ahead and, is there any general public comment? Seeing none, we'll close the general public comment, and we'll go next to item number one.
Item number one is a motion, Garcetti Labange, relative to requesting the city attorney to remove Section G of the Los Angeles Municipal Code, Section 21.27, and make any other amendments necessary to preserve the entertainment and multimedia tax incentive.
All righty. We had in our code a entertainment multimedia tax incentive that helped us attract media-based companies, entertainment and media companies to two areas in the CRA LA, the Hollywood redevelopment area and the North Hollywood redevelopment area. This was actually a pretty integral piece of legislation to attract, among others, Nielsen, which headquartered in Hollywood, TV Guide, and others, as we looked at the dissolution of the Community Redevelopment Agency. We put a motion forward to see what we could do to define, not based on CRA areas, although the project areas do continue, but based on geography. So I know with this motion, we've been recommended that we receive and file the motion, but I'd like to request the CLA and the Office of Finance to report back with recommendations on how to preserve the entertainment and multimedia tax incentive after the expiration of the redevelopment agency. The City Attorney's Office is deemed that removing the Section G, which said that if ever the Hollywood redevelopment area or North Hollywood redevelopment area shall become dissolved, the provision shall not apply thereafter to businesses located within what had been the boundaries of the dissolved area. I think the intention of that in the past was assuming that redevelopment was over in a natural course, since it came artificially, that we're in a different circumstance. And the City Attorney's Office deemed that removing Section G would make the ordinance illegal as it relates to our city charter, because it would create an unfair advantage if it wasn't specifically tied to an economic development area. So I think what we can do is tie it to some other sort of economic development area, whether that's going to be looking at the enterprise zones that we have or other areas. But I don't know, is the city attorney here? Want to just come forward and help walk us through a little bit of what your thoughts might be. Good morning.
Good morning. Deputy City Attorney Dan Whitley.
Nice to see you, Dan.
Yeah, you're exactly right. The reason that section is there is to comply with Charter Section 104B, which does provide that these sorts of tax incentives do need to be tied to an economic development zone or tax incentive area. And currently that was tied to the redevelopment zone. And we checked with the CRA, and currently that zone is going to be in existence in both of these areas until I believe the earliest one lapses in 2020. So those are going to be in existence for some time. And we can get you those exact dates, I think, later today.
I think, May 7th, 2027 in Hollywood, February 21st, 2021 for North Hollywood is what I have here.
Yeah, that's correct. And so we have some time to try and develop some further economic zones for those areas, and we can try and do that in the future. But we do need to have something in the ordinance that's going to give us a zone that we can tie the incentives to.
Can I ask you, if we looked at creating new economic development zones, economic priority zones, just as formal designation areas, priority areas for the city, for things like obviously the state, enterprise zones, the federal renewal communities and things like that are just that. They're tax credits given to certain areas where there's lower income, lower employment, et cetera. Could the city actually create those zones, just designating, and what those zones would become is essentially places that would have lower gross receipts tax?
We could. The thing we need to be careful about is that in the charter it says there need to be tax incentive areas. So we need to make sure that they aren't just simply taking with one hand and giving back with the other, that they actually are a tax incentive area. So the one thing that had been mentioned was business improvement districts. Mm-hmm. Those are probably not going to meet the requirements of the charter section. Yeah,
because some of those are quite well off, and I mean, you could still create them, but they're, they exist on Rodeo Drive as well as existing, not in the city of LA, obviously, but as much as they exist on Vermont Avenue, too. So-
Right.
So there'd have to be some nexus to economic need.
Well, what business improvement districts do is slightly different. What they do essentially is they just they take money out of our general fund to allow the business improvement district to take the taxes to simply direct it to the business improvement district. They don't actually give them much of a credit. They're just essentially using the money for their own needs.
I think, except they don't, just to make sure on the record, they don't take from the city's general fund. It's a self-assessment.
Exactly.
Right.
So they don't meet exactly what the language of the charter requires.
Right.
But we can create other sorts of
Okay.
development zones.
Might be an interesting thing, just to add to the conversation for our CLA, as we're looking at post-CRA, what sort of economic development strategies we pursue in reconstituting some sort of economic development entities, whether or not economic priority zones or something that would be a city-based version of, tax credits, looking at workforce training dollars, et cetera, that we'd be able to focus on specific areas of the city that are still underdeveloped. Could be something worth studying. But okay, so I will receive and file the motion, ask the city attorney to work together with the CLA and the Office of Finance and see if we can get some recommendations on how we can preserve this. But you feel confident right now, as is, because the expiration dates are late, that this is still in effect?
Well, right now it is. There's some other issues that we need to work with, but right now we would like to leave this as it is and move forward without change. And we'll address it as issues arise.
Okay, great. All right, thank you. Mr. LaBonge? Mr. LaBonge has no comments today, so. Anybody else on item number 1 from the public? If not, let's go to item number 2. Thank you.
Item number 2 is a motion, Garcetti, Rosendahl, Labange, relative to the effectiveness of ordinance number 181127 to attract and retain internet-based companies and a draft ordinance amending section 21.4 of the Los Angeles Municipal Code to make the internet-based business tax classification permanent.
All right, let me take public comment on this first. Lloyd Greff, if you'd like to come forward, chair of our BTAC. Oh, if it's just general public comment, why don't you do it from the podium? Thanks, Lloyd.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I just wanted to register BTAC support for an extension of the lower tax rates for internet-based businesses. The key point here is that these are extremely mobile businesses. The types of jobs created by these businesses are the high-quality jobs that I think we want to retain and attract to the city of Los Angeles. They're high-quality jobs, they're high-paying jobs. Internet companies is clearly a wave of the future in terms of what's driving the economy. We're trying to set up a Silicon Beach here to compete with the Silicon Valley in Northern California. And I think it's important that the tax policy for the city of Los Angeles be designed to incentivize businesses to stay here and come here, and particularly in this category. So we've looked at that at BTAC, and we're totally on board with seeing this extend beyond 2014, and we hope that that, in fact, will be what will occur here.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lloyd. And obviously, we put this motion in because we share the same perspective, which is not to say that we in any way back away from the overall efforts of BTAC and the committee chair to get rid of all of the gross receipts tax, but in the meantime, having this in place, keeping companies like Shopzilla, attracting companies like Google, have been a very positive outcome of this. Secondly, though, knowing that if just a reduction in rates is not enough to keep some companies, we lost, for instance, LegalZoom.com to just over the border because we still have a low rate, but still a rate of a business tax. So let's go ahead and hear any reports or thoughts.
Yeah, Pete Galang, Chief TCO2 from the Office of Finance. After the ordinance was passed, we have registered 44 internet-based business company, and 22 of those are existing businesses and 22 are new businesses.
And how do you make that that determination when they apply to the city in terms of what whether they fit into this category or not?
Yes, we did.
And the reason I bring this up is I think the internet is increasingly turning towards video, and we have probably about 90% of the internet in bandwidth of the internet will be used by video in the coming years. We have companies that are setting up studios from Silicon Valley down here right now, and in some ways it will look like traditional media companies. You hear YouTube, setting up channels for food and channels for travel and things that would be almost like television. But I think it's going to be, we're going to struggle in the coming years defining what is a internet-based company. For instance, if YouTube is producing content themselves versus NBC Universal, which is producing content. And we could say, well, one of them primarily goes through the internet to get its product out there, but NBC Universal uses some of the same pipelines when they go through cable, for instance, that would be used for the distribution of internet-based. Do we have any any method for determining who is and who isn't internet-based, and have you had any folks who have either appealed or said, look, we really are internet, and we're saying, no, you're not? Has that come up yet, or is this something just to flag for the future?
When we do a review of the business activity, we follow what is in the ordinance, and I think the ordinance is really clearly is very specific as to the nature of the business for the internet-based businesses.
So, so you haven't had any circumstances when which people have said, "Hey, we really are internet. We're not being found," or has everybody been, for the most part, satisfied?
No, we just, like I said, we just follow the ordinance, the definition of the ordinance.
So nobody's ever appealed from a different category saying, "No, we're internet-based." In other words, somebody who has a higher tax because they were put in a category that isn't the internet-based classification. Have they ever appealed and saying, we are an internet company, why haven't you determined that? Or have we not had that circumstance?
Yeah, we have received some applications, and they're claiming that they are internet-based business, and we have reviewed it, and some they qualify and some they don't.
Can you think of any of the examples of ones that have been rejected? I'm just, for my thinking, as I think we're going to have to change how we think about what an internet-based company is, talking to many of the industry leaders that I have. So do you know any of those examples, for instance, of you can talk about it abstractly, you don't have to say the specific company name, but...
For example, a business that uses internet in order to sell their products, I don't think they will qualify as internet-based businesses. Just selling their products through the internet, they won't qualify.
So an Amazon would not qualify, like Amazon.com, which sells its products through the internet, which exclusively sells products through the internet, if they were based in Los Angeles, would not qualify?
I'm sure they won't.
Okay. I think if you can maybe just share with us privately some of the examples of ones that have been turned down, just to help again on the thinking, not as a criticism at all of the Office of Finance, but I want to make sure, because I've talked to some companies that do want to come down to Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. They are producing more traditional media, but it's just for the internet. And so I want to make sure they're not caught in just being put into an entertainment category or something else when they're kind of producing a new internet-based entertainment model. So if you might be able to share with my staff some of the ones that have been the case studies of the ones that have been turned down, that will help us just be able to define that clearly. Okay?
Yes, I will provide that information.
Mr. City Attorney?
Councilman,
Yeah.
if I can interrupt for a second. The way both of these ordinances that address the internet businesses were drafted, they apply only to businesses that exclusively obtain their revenues through internet activities. So a business that does anything that's not exclusive through the internet would not be able to obtain these tax rates. So any business like NBC or any business like that has any revenues that aren't generated through the internet would not be able to use these sections.
So let me just play that out one step further then. If let's say YouTube decided to start having some brick and mortar stores, so a portion of their business no longer was just based on the internet, would they then be excluded for that internet-based part of their business from this business tax category?
That's correct. Or another example would be like ArcLight Cinemas, for instance, has an internet application they use to sell some of their tickets, and that would also not apply to ArcLight Cinemas, and that's the reason it was drafted this way. It was meant to be applying to Shopzilla, which has it's exclusively through the internet, and that was supposed to apply to them, and that was kind of our example of who this was supposed to apply to.
And I understand making sure that people don't back 5 or 10% of their business that is internet-based into getting a new category, but the inverse seems to be a little bit troubling. If you had a company that's 95% internet-based that decides, if Google starts to have some retail stores, for instance, that their headquarters that are here in Los Angeles would suddenly start to be taxed at a different rate, even though all what they're doing at their headquarters there is internet-based. So is there any nuance of, we have had in the past companies that pay in more than one category, but that doesn't exist with this?
That does not. I'm just trying to explain what the ordinance does, and that's what it does. There wasn't any leeway in the ordinance as drafted,
okay.
So that's something that we may need to look at and address as things adapt.
This category aside from the Office of Finance, if a company does some work that is legal, and some work that is retail, and some work that is, let's say it's a large conglomerate that has different parts of the company, do we tax under one category or multiple?
Different categories, depending on the activities.
So can this be a category of a company?
Meaning category of business activity, we tax them on different funds class.
So can the internet-based tax classification be a category?
Yes, if they have that activity, then they will be taxed on the gross receipts that they earn as internet-based businesses.
But you're saying that it's not written that way, Mr. City Attorney.
I'm just explaining what the ordinance says by
Okay.
its terms. How Office of Finance is applying it, I can't comment.
Okay, all right. No, I think that may resolve my issue. Thank you for bearing with me, but I wanted to make sure that we have folks also that if they have multiple business categories and one of them is internet-based, that we can still give them the internet-based tax classification break and incentive, essentially.
If the internet-based businesses is more than 75% of their gross receipts, then they will qualify for the single category fund class,
Thank
and
you.
they can put all their gross receipts on that fund class.
And if it's less, they may be in that category and other ones.
Yes.
Okay, all right. And that's not in violation of how you see it's written? If 75%, they're interpreting 75% or above, it can be all internet-based?
I believe that must be their administrative interpretation. I can just tell you what the language of the statute says.
Okay.
They haven't come to
I'm
us.
comfortable with the administrative interpretation, so let's not dig too deep there. Okay, great. Well, let's go ahead with this. Let's adopt this motion and transmit it to council. I think it's due in council today, is that right, Marcel? Yeah, we'll be seeing this in council today, so with that, sorry? Oh, it's the other one. Sorry, everybody's like, no, not this one.
Mr. Chair, this item is also referred to Budget and Finance, and they haven't waived the
Got it.
motion yet.
I'll talk to Mr. Krikorian about when we want to schedule that. All right, so let's go ahead and if we can also, as well as adopted, instruct the Office of Finance, CLA, and CAO, if we can report back in 30 days with an analysis of the effectiveness, I'd like to see, it's great to hear those 44 companies, 22. And if we have the chance to, I wouldn't mind the CLA, Office of Finance, to pick up the phone and just call some of them and say, look, were you looking at leaving for those that were existing, and did this help you stay or not? And for the ones that came, was this an incentive at all to come to Los Angeles as well? Mr. Greif, did you want to add something?
Yes, I just thought it was curious that Amazon.com would not be considered to be an internet-based business, since I think 100% of its business is done through the internet.
Well, I think
it is
the
an
Office
e-commerce
of
company.
Yeah, I think the Office of Finance corrected themselves that they would be. I think if I can put words into your mouth, I think as the city attorney said, it's just if another company like Frito-Lay had a small portion they started to sell online, that would not necessarily kick them into the
But I thought Mr. Galang said that Amazon.com would not be considered an internet-based business.
He did, but I think that was corrected. If we had 100%, if we had a business that sold 100% exclusively on the internet, that's an internet-based company. He used Shopzilla as the example.
Is that correct, Mr. Galang?
We can't comment on specific taxpayers. I think a taxpayer that is a retailer through the internet probably wouldn't qualify under either of these classifications as written, but that's something we would need to look at on a case-by-case basis.
Although we do at the Office of Finance today, I mean, I know they're an intermediary for retailers, but Shopzilla does qualify, correct?
Yes.
Shopzilla would be, they are a data compiler, and not a retailer, as I understand it. But I would need to spend some time looking at exactly what they do, and I couldn't comment on exactly how Shopzilla would be.
Well, for the Office of Finance, if there were, let's say a big company did want a Zappos or a Amazon or somebody that exclusively sells through the internet, they're an internet-based retail entity, would they, under the Office of Finance's current interpretation, not fit into this category, or would they?
From what I know, that Amazon sells their goods through the internet, they won't qualify. As long as they just use the internet to sell their goods, they won't qualify.
I think this bears a little bit more analysis then, because, for instance, Shopzilla and Amazon's models are not very different. A lot of what Amazon does is data compilation. They don't have, with all their affiliates and everything that they do, they're essentially a through body, a third party that has independent affiliates that sell online. Their appliances they don't necessarily have in their warehouses. They do have their books in their warehouses, but many of those things are not. So it does, I think I share with Mr. Greif, I would hate for us to not have the opportunity to recognize that as internet-based commerce in the same way.
Well, excuse me, we need more information on Amazon in order for us to really rightfully decide whether they are really not qualified or not.
Well, why don't we do this? It's not so much Amazon, because I don't think they're picking up from Washington and coming down here anytime soon. That was just the example. But the next Amazon or the next big company may want to be here. We do have, for instance, not in the city of LA, but in Santa Monica, a company called Beach Mint, which does a lot of fashion and makeup and other things that they sell online. And again, they're an intermediary for a lot of folks, and they also sell some of their own things. But that would be a huge gain for the city of LA if they ever wanted to move over the border. This is increasingly going to be the space in which I think a lot of internet-based companies are. And so I want to make sure that we, at least on the city's gross receipts tax, because now under the state law, we'll get the sales tax, we'll get a lot of the other benefits, really define that a little bit more carefully. So let me add to the instruction to report back in 30 days with the effectiveness of this ordinance, to look specifically at what the definitions for internet-based retailers are. This is, again, I think at the end of the day, going to be a policy-based decision. So if we want to take that step and define that, we can do that as a body. Please bring up what issues vis-a-vis, brick and mortar retailers we would have in terms of the charter. But looking at that, especially when you're looking at folks who are selling mostly outside the city of LA, it would be a lost opportunity for us not to have some of those based here, because it's not that we're giving an unfair advantage to the brick and mortar store down the street, because most, 99% of the business may be out of the city of LA. And for us not to have those companies here would be a missed opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's important for the committee to recognize that this is a growing segment of the economy, and LA wants to be competitive in attracting these types of businesses to the city.
Absolutely.
And I think it's also important to recognize that internet-based companies, e-commerce companies, are extremely mobile, and nothing prevents them from going across city lines to locate outside the city if it turns out that we're going to penalize them based on our business tax.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so we'll add that to the report back as well. Okay. All right, and shows effective instructing the Office of Finance, CLA-CAO, to report back in 30 days on the analysis of the effectiveness of the ordinance to attract and retain internet-based companies. Instruct the city attorney to prepare and present an ordinance amending section 21.41 of the municipal code to make the internet-based businesses tax classification permanent. I'd like to work on that as well.
Okay, Councilman, I do have some questions about making
Sure.
it permanent. Now, the reason that this section has a sunset date at 2014 is because of the ramifications of Prop 218, which requires that all tax increases be approved by the voters. The reason that the city attorney recommends that council includes those sorts of provisions in all tax provisions is that if anything develops that is a problem with these sorts of taxing provisions, we can't change it easily unless we have a sunset provision in these taxing ordinances. So if something develops where our language is interpreted by the courts to be differently than we intended, we can't do anything about it. We're stuck with it unless there's a sunset provision or something of that nature in the ordinance. So we try and put in a sunset provision that's long enough for us to have time to examine how the ordinance is interpreted and applied, so that then we can have the city address the situation and change it as we're seeing today, that it might not be working as intended, and we can have changes made to the language or apply it differently. If we remove the sunset provision, there's really nothing we can do to change it in the future other than going to the voters and having an election.
Correct. And I know that Groundhog Day was last week or was last Thursday, and I appreciate that the city attorney looking at what the city budget ramifications are, and we may just have some philosophical differences on this, and this is a recurrent theme in this committee, but in that scenario, the worst case scenario is that it can never come back. And for me, we have companies right now that are making decisions about whether to come to Los Angeles, and every time there is an out, a date that this could expire by. For instance, we had in here that when we talked to a company that wants to come, the asset management company that wants to come here from Pasadena, a 5-year thing isn't good enough. They need the predictability that they will never have a gross receipts tax. In doing so, they can bring hundreds of jobs here. An office tower will be built by LA Live because they need an anchor tenant. The spillover effect, I think, just in my philosophy, far outweighs. So I understand your hesitation, but if we keep sending those signals, in some ways I think we just lose these companies. So we celebrate that we have a way out, but these companies say, well, I don't trust that a future body, because it's not going to be you necessarily, 4 or 5 years from now, would put this back. So let's look at how we would draft it, and we can have that policy discussion, and we can see where people land on it at all.
Well, if I could ask that if it's the term of the sunset that's the issue, if we could perhaps look at maybe having a longer term. It worries us that there's nothing we can do, because we have had issues where in the past, fortunately, we could address these ordinances, and because this does deal with the internet, and as you have said, this is an expanding area of commerce. It's impossible for us to see what's going to happen.
Well, as chair of the committee and as somebody who wants to abolish the gross receipts tax altogether, I'm going to make the instruction that we draft that and that we make that policy decision. I understand for those who want to cling on to, potentially being able to retain the gross receipts tax, but I've personally done all my thinking on that and talked to enough companies that this is the direction I'd like to head in. But very respectfully, I understand why you have that perspective. I understand why a lot of people are saying don't lose that. But the flip side, which I'll just say again and again and again, is that other companies, even with an extended sunset date, are making determinations. An internet-based company, just to be very specific to the points that are here, I've had conversations with a number of CEOs that say, even the possibility in 20 years of there being a gross receipts tax where we're headquartered, even a very low rate, when we go public for $1 billion company, is millions of dollars in valuation. Literally, it's millions of dollars in valuation. How can I look at my board and my investors and say, oh, we really want to be in the city of LA because when we go public, we're going to do good for the city of LA. It's a very competitive environment out there. That's exactly why we lost LegalZoom.com. They said, we go over the border, and when we go public, it's a small percentage of our overall valuation, but it is in the millions, your little gross receipts tax. And even if we don't have it for a couple of years, or even if we didn't have it for 10 years, the market will value it based on knowing that it could come back. So I think for those companies, we're going to be arguing about, hey, we preserved our flexibility, but why aren't there any internet companies coming to LA? And I want the internet companies to come to LA. So let's go ahead and draft it that way. And I respect that. I've just done a lot of consultation, a lot of work on this, and I think that without doing that, and at least having the option, I'll make that case to my colleagues. We're not going to be competitive for these specific kinds of companies.
Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate it. All right. With that, let's go ahead and adopt the motion, transmit to council. And thank you all. I guess this meeting is adjourned.